Welcome back to Life to the Max. Everybody has a main street that they remember if they grew up in a rural town. Sauk Centre has a main street. And they have an author that made it famous. His name is Sinclair Lewis. In 1920, Main Street in Sauk Centre, Minnesota was the center of attention among literary circles in the country. Hometown author Sinclair Lewis published the novel Main Street, which was inspired by his years growing up in Sauk Centre. The fictitious village of Gopher Prairie was much like many others, but this small town story launched Lewis into the big time.
It was the biggest selling novel in American history up to that time. In the first year they sold 298,000 books. They figured there were only about 300,000 people in America that bought books regularly.
Part of the genesis of his genius came from his hometown and his home.
The relationship with Sauk Centre is similar to the relationship with his father. There's a tension there that although he loved his father, he felt uncomfortable with his father. I think he loved Sauk Centre, but he felt uncomfortable coming home.
Harry Sinclair Lewis was born in 1885 and was raised in this modest home a couple of blocks off Main Street. His father, Dr. E.J. Lewis, ran a tight ship, and timing was everything.
Well, each evening the cook would make the meal in the kitchen, then put it through this passway to either E.J. or Isabel would grab it and set the table. E.J. was a very punctual person. Supper had to always be at 6 o'clock.
Dr. Lewis had more patience with his patients than with his family.
This is one of our family's prized possessions. This is Dr. E.J. Lewis's ledger for office visits.
Pat Lewis and her husband Dick Lewis live in St. Cloud. Dick is a great nephew of Sinclair's.
His bill came to $35, and in here he was paid by 10 cords of poplar wood, $20.
Besides using the barter system, being a prairie doctor meant house calls, at the house.
That's a familiar sound that Harry heard most of his young life, particularly in the evenings if there was an emergency in town. His father, being a doctor, was the first place they would go to if there was an accident out by the railroad tracks or a fight in a bar or saloon. And people would bring their patients here.
But medicine could not save his mother, Emma. She died in the house from tuberculosis. Sinclair was 6 and became withdrawn. His stepmother, Isabel, however, helped him come out of that shell. But Harry was still more interested in books than people, and a little bit awkward.
Somebody recently told me that he was really a dork and a nerd because he was a reader. He was somewhat shy initially.
While in high school, his first published writings appeared in the Sauk Centre Herald. Lewis also worked the front desk at the historic Palmer House on Main Street. He was fired 3 times, once because he was writing instead of working. Harry graduated from high school in 1902 and attended Oberlin College and then off to Yale, where his career took off. He wrote for the Saturday Evening Post and penned several books by 1919. And then 15 years in the making came the classic that shook America.
He had hoped to come home to Sauk Centre and just write about his hometown, and just, it didn't work for him. He hadn't been home for a couple years. He had all kinds of idealistic views of what his hometown was, and it wasn't what he thought it was.
A book about narrow-minded thinking had a broad appeal. Within a few years, Main Street sales reached 2 million.
Lewis was part of a movement called the realist movement. Let's take a real look at what life is like. And people saw those characters, good, bad, and ugly, and they knew them.
Some of the locals took offense to the negative perception. Nearby Alexandria, Minnesota, even banned the book.
Lewis wasn't a warm and fuzzy writer. He wasn't like a Mark Twain, who had these lovable characters. You know, his characters were real and sometimes uncomfortable.
After penning Aerosmith about the medical field, he received the Pulitzer Prize. In 1930, Lewis became the first American writer to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Sinclair Lewis suffered his share of personal upheaval. Sinclair, also known as Red, battled alcohol in his later years. Sadly, he died alone in Rome at age 65 and is buried in Sauk Centre, at the eastern end of Sinclair Lewis Avenue.
His brother Claude tipped the urn into the ground, and some of his ashes got away, blew in the wind, and they thought that was a restless questing of his entire life.
His restless spirit has been embraced by Sauk Centre. Even the high school nickname is the Main Streeters. In 1960, the Sinclair Lewis Foundation was formed and opened the Sinclair Lewis Museum.
It offers an insight into Sinclair Lewis's life, the way he wrote books and how he wrote books, and what he used to illustrate how he was going to write his books and where he was going to find the names for his characters in the books.
Our family is still celebrating Sinclair Lewis, how many books he had written, how important they were to America.
The impact of his books is still reverberating today. He put Sauk Centre, Minnesota on the map with the small-town upbringing, helping create one of America's most influential writers, Harry Sinclair Lewis.
For more information on Life to the Max, go to our website at lifetothemax.tv.